Did I get your attention with that title? I hope so. And I hope that if you're either a futurist or a preterist, that you are interested enough to listen to what I have to say. Because I want to tell you my journey through both viewpoints that brought me to where I am right now. And my hope is that this will bring some unity to all of these discussions and some unity to Christians at some level. Because right now there is a lot of division. And I really don't think that it has to be that way. Preterists feel disregard and disdain from the futurists, and futurists think that the preterists are just arrogant about their views. But I think if you pay attention to what I'm going to say during this video, you'll realize that we're all on the same track. With just a little more understanding, I think that we can come together and have a clear, traditional Christian view, and also understand the eschatology of what is called the end times. To catch you up a little bit on my background, I grew up as a futurist, a premillennial dispensationalist. So I had that eschatology of the Left Behind series, the idea that sometime in our future, possibly within our lifetimes, but probably not, that Jesus would come from heaven and appear in the sky, and that in the twinkling of an eye, a moment so small you can't even perceive it, that Christians would vanish from the earth and be taken to heaven with Jesus, and that all the humans left on earth would be left to fend for themselves in a hellish apocalyptic world where Satan or the Antichrist ruled over things and tortured and imprisoned Christians for their beliefs, anyone that became a Christian after the fact, and that the world would be plagued by wars and violence. And it just literally would be a hell on earth situation until some point at which many people in that viewpoint think that Jesus would come back to the earth and then rule and reign and take over and fix everything. And the Jews, of course, piggyback onto that belief system by saying at that point they would rule the earth with Jesus from Jerusalem. So I grew up with that kind of a mentality, that kind of a eschatological doctrinal viewpoint. But not too many years ago, I had an epiphany about the first century and 70 AD specifically. And I've told this story before on my channel, but here's a summary of it. In 2018, I got this book in my mailbox. It was a book from the Seventh-day Adventists. They apparently get these books that are important to them and they put them in people's mailboxes for free. So the book that was in my mailbox that day was The Great Controversy by Ellen G. White, one of the founders of Seventh-day Adventism. So as a Protestant, Baptist, fundamental Christian, I decided I was going to read this Seventh-day Adventist book just so I could understand what they believed. I really, at the time, didn't know much about their belief system at all. So what surprised me is that when I got into that book, the very first chapter that I read had everything to do with what happened in 70 AD and the events that led up to the destruction of the Jewish temple, Herod's temple, in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so what I thought was just going to be an educational exercise turned into a life-changing moment, really. When I realized that all of these miraculous events had happened at that time, so many in fact, and so profound, that I realized it had to be God's handiwork. There was no other explanation for what happened. And of course, all this led up to the destruction of the temple and the judgment of the Jews, which had been prophesied in the Old Testament over and over again. So this discovery truly forced me to realize that this event in 70 AD and the destruction of the temple was something that God himself had orchestrated and allowed to happen. And that this was a fulfillment of those prophecies in the Old Testament that talked about the coming judgment on the Jews and chastising them for their wickedness. And this then led me on a journey to discover everything I could about this time period. And many people have this same experience when they realize their whole lives they have not been taught anything about 70 AD and the amazing things that happened at that time. it seems to gin up this type of reaction inside of you. You got to find out everything that you weren't told. And so that's exactly what I did. I had to go find out for myself. So I did a deep dive of the book of Daniel. I read it numerous times. And of course, in that study, I did realize that Daniel was mostly pointing to the coming of Christ. Daniel chapter 9 prophesying the advent of Christ, and also even prophesying many events that led up to the judgment of Israel. And of course, that made sense because Daniel was an Israelite. And so God was giving him a prophecy that spoke directly about what would happen to his people, especially since they were at the time in exile in Babylon. So this study in the book of Daniel definitely convinced me that it was talking about Christ's coming or his advent. The word advent means appearing or revealing. And it was the advent of Christ, his birth by the Virgin Mary. That was the advent of our Christ, our Savior. And I realized that this was the coming that most of the Old Testament texts referring to the coming Messiah were talking about. It was talking about his incarnation on earth. Then after this study, I started to realize that there's this view out there called preterism, and that it has a shared understanding of the events of 70 AD. So I started learning a lot about preterism. Of course, preterism kind of conflates Christ's advent with 70 AD. And it calls 70 AD a, quote, coming, with a capital C, coming of Christ. Some preterists, called full preterists, believe that 70 AD was not only a coming of Christ, but the only coming of Christ, and that there would be no other. But others, called partial preterists, say that 70 AD was one coming of Christ, and that there would be another in the future. So I learned at the time, I learned all of this. This would have been in about 2018. And I always held at this point a bit of a partial preterist understanding or belief system, because I always felt that there was definitely a final judgment and a remaking of heaven and earth in the future. And that was because I saw it talked about very plainly and literally in Revelation chapter 20 and 21. Of course, full preterists try to allegorize the idea of the new heaven and new earth to make everything in the past. Full preterists believing that all prophecy and all fulfillment of prophecy had occurred by the time of 70 AD. But I never accepted that view because it allegorized something that all the early Christian writings, including some passages even in the Bible, took as a literal occurrence. The Christians expected those things to happen in the future, both New Testament Christians and the Christians who wrote after the New Testament. So after studying Daniel heavily and then understanding a lot about preterism and the different views there, I moved on to the book of Revelation. And I ended up reading the book 25 times in a row during my study. I feel now that I do understand the contents of the book very, very well. But I also feel that preterism colored my view of eschatology, if you will. The hyper focus of the preterists on the coming of Christ, so to speak, in 70 AD caused me in my study to kind of take that for granted. But I never really questioned it that heavily because, of course, I was still running on the notion of all of these miraculous things that happened around the time of 70 AD and just kind of accepting the fact that it must have been something so consequential that I've just missed. That to say it was the coming of Christ seemed appropriate at the time. But at this time, I also started trying to force some of the verses in the New Testament into the view that Jesus came in 70 AD incorrectly. So this whole time, I continued pushing my studies further and further. So I started pushing into the early Christian writers. These are the writings that many people call the writings of the early church fathers, whether you like that term or not. These are those writings, the writings of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. And as I read these, I started to realize some things. There were some things on which all of these church writings, these early Christian writings, agreed upon. Number one, that the Jews had been judged by God in 70 AD. They all agreed that that was the judgment on the Jews. There was no question. Number two, that Christ was on the throne in their time, the time period after his advent and his resurrection and ascension, that Christ was on the throne and the kingdom was in force. And Christ had all authority in that kingdom. And number three, all of these Christian writers agreed that there was a resurrection and a coming of Christ in the future at what they called the end of the world. And as I studied these early Christian writings, I found out that these were not only the views of the early church, but I continued studying different Christian writings throughout history and found that these same beliefs persisted way out in history, centuries and centuries forward, even to the time of the Reformers in the 15th century. The Reformers were the same. Even Christians of the modern day have somewhat similar eschatological beliefs to these very early Christians, to the traditional historic Christianity, though admittedly, the modern version of some of these eschatological ideas is skewed quite a bit. So what is that skew? Well, it's mostly that the modern Jews have convinced the world that the promises that God made to Israel in the Old Testament, one, apply to them, which they don't. They applied to the Israelites at the time of Christ, not the modern day Jews. Number two, that the fulfillments of the promises are yet to come for Jews. But the reality is that they already occurred for the most part in the past, at the time of Christ. And number three, they try to convince the world that the prophecies and promises of the Old Testament will make them in the end the rulers of the world, physically, which the prophecies don't do this. They were mostly actually spiritual promises about things like heaven and the eternal destination of the Jews that stayed true to God. So that is how they shifted and mangled the ideas of traditional, historical Christian eschatology into the current dispensational viewpoint. And that is the basis of the problems that have beset modern Christianity, and particularly mainstream Protestant Christianity, since the birth of dispensationalism. Dispensationalism put a new emphasis on the Jews that had not been there in any Christian doctrine since the time of Christ. The Reformers themselves didn't prop up the Jews or put them on a pedestal or venerate them in any way. Just look at Martin Luther. He wrote a book entitled The Jews and Their Lies. And this book was all about the Jews of his time in 15th century Germany, where the Jews were more or less despised by Christians. So if you think for a second that the Reformers in any way appreciated the Jews in that time period, you should read this book. You should understand what Christians really thought of Jews during that time period. And think to yourself, how has that changed? Why has that changed in the modern day? Because these reformers more or less saw the Jews as a blight on both Christianity and the world in their time. But this dispensational and Jew-centered eschatology has crept into mainline Christianity, producing what we call the Tim LaHaye, left behind, premillennial, futurist, end times beliefs. And we actually do have the Jews to thank for that, because they bankrolled the infiltration of dispensational thought into Christianity by paying for both Bible translations to be made that included commentary that was dispensational, and they also bankrolled the founding of Christian seminaries all over America that taught dispensational, Jew-centered eschatology. And then also what I think we have in preterism is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to this dispensational theology that causes people to doubt even traditional Christian thought and doctrine. The full preterists particularly push every Christian doctrine of the end times into 70 AD in an effort to rid themselves of this hellish storybook fantasy of the dispensational end times mythology, full of wars, antichrists, Christian persecution, and mass vanishings of people out of their clothes, you need to realize that preterism, both full preterism and partial preterism, put more emphasis on 70 AD than any Christian writer in history ever did. I believe that if Christians would actually read the Christian writings, we would all have a better understanding of this. But after 70 AD, not a single Christian writer said that Jesus' coming had occurred. Not a single Christian writer said that now every prophecy has been fulfilled. And not a single Christian writer said that no longer does prophecy apply to us anymore. In fact, every single Christian writer contradicted these viewpoints. Every single one. So the preterists end up being left to try to explain why nobody after 70 AD held their viewpoints. Nobody. Most do not try to explain it. Sometimes they will say that there was some kind of mass psychosis that prevented Christians from understanding what had just occurred, the gravity of what occurred in 70 AD. But this is really a preposterous assertion, a complete fantasy. So what we need to realize is that we all, on both sides of the fence, preterists and futurists, and probably anyone that holds any other kind of eschatology, all these have really been shaped and twisted by history and sometimes by bad actors. And based on my research, most of that twisting and skewing of these views has occurred in modern history. As I have read much Christian literature throughout history, it seems quite evident to me that the message of Christ and the early Christians, and even that of the reformers, was rather consistent. They believed that, number one, Jesus was incarnated as a baby, born of a virgin, and that was his advent, his coming, his original coming. And that number two, Israel was judged by the mighty hand of God under the authority of Christ at 70 AD, when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed by the Romans. And then number three, they all believed that Jesus would come again at the end of history, when God would pass judgment on the entire human race at the great white throne, and that those who were righteous would be gathered together with Christ to live with him on the new earth, also with a new heaven. These views are consistent with Christian literature, starting from the earliest writings, including the New Testament, to the latest Christian writings, straight up until the modern time. My hope is really that you can see this, and that Christians all over the world can at least coexist with one another, regardless of their eschatological beliefs. The reality is really that what you believe about the end of the earth, or the lack thereof, if that's what you believe, does not really matter to God so much. What really truly matters is, number one, that you believe that Jesus is your King, the King, because he is. And number two, that you believe that God raised him or resurrected him from the dead, because he did. And number three, that you model your life after the commands of Jesus Christ, which start with loving God the Father first and foremost, and then loving others as yourself, these being his most important commandments by his own words. After these simple things, understanding the nuance of the when and the how and the what of the end times is not a requirement for anything except arguing with fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. If we can get over this thing and unite as believers, I believe then we will have a much greater impact on the world around us as the kingdom of God on earth, united. And trust me, when the end does happen, whatever that is, it won't matter what you believe about it. And it probably won't be exactly like anyone thinks it's going to be. But I will tell you this, that my own personal opinion is that you need to be ready for it within your lifetime. O blessed servants, whom, when the Master comes, he finds awake, and they all watch at all times and expect with sleepless eyes. For it will be at dawn or eve or midday, but he sure shall come. Thank you for your time, and God bless.